The moment I saw my breath crystallize in the beam of my flashlight, I understood that something in Blackwater Hollow had been waiting for me, not patiently, not with hunger, but with the quiet certainty of a thing that knows its prey will eventually walk right into its mouth. Before we begin, please consider subscribing, and don't forget to like the video and share it with your close friends and family. I would also love to hear where you are listening from. Thank you all for the support. It truly means a lot to me. Now, let's start. January in the West Virginia Highlands arrives like a slow death. The kind that creeps through window frames and settles into your bones before you realize you've stopped shivering because your body has simply given up fighting. The cold. I had driven 6 hours from Richmond to reach my uncle's property near Elkins, a patch of inherited land I'd never bothered to visit until the legal paperwork forced my hand. The GPS had failed somewhere past Parsons, the signal dissolving into static like a voice being swallowed by deep water, and I'd spent the last hour navigating by increasingly unreliable road signs and a hand-drawn map my uncle had mailed me. 3 years before his death, the cabin revealed itself through the trees, just as the sun began its final descent behind the ridgeline, casting everything in that peculiar amber light that makes even ordinary things look like they belong to another time. It was smaller than I'd expected as an English story, structure of weathered logs and tar paper roofing that seemed to crouch against the hillside as if trying to hide from the surrounding forest. The windows were intact but filmed with decades of grime, and the front door hung slightly ajar in a way that suggested it had been like that for a very long time. What struck me first wasn't the isolation, though that was profound. No power lines, no cell towers, nothing but an endless expanse of bare oak and dying hemlock stretching in every direction. What struck me was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a winter evening, but something thicker and more deliberate, as if the air itself had been compressed into a substance that absorbed sound rather than carried it. When I stepped out of my car, the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground seemed muffled, distant, like hearing someone else's footsteps through a wall. I should have turned around right then. I should have recognized that wrongness for what it was, a warning, the kind that creatures far older and wiser than humans learned to heed millions of years before we walked upright. But I had driven too far, and it was getting too dark. And there's something about exhaustion that makes even terrible decisions feel reasonable. The cabin's interior matched its exterior, abandoned but not destroyed, as if my uncle had simply stepped out one day and never returned. Canned goods still lined a shelf in the small kitchen area, their labels faded but intact. A rocking chair sat before a stone fireplace filled with ancient ash. Photographs hung on the walls, my uncle. As a younger man, my grandfather I barely remembered, faces of strangers whose names had been lost to time. The whole place smelled of dust and old wood and something else. Something I couldn't identify, but that made the back of my throat tighten with an unnameable unease. I managed to get a fire going as darkness fully claimed the hollow. The flames? Casting dancing shadows across walls that seemed to breathe with the flickering light. I ate cold beans from a can I'd brought and tried to read a book by firelight, but the words kept sliding off my brain like water off stone. The silence outside pressed against the windows like a physical weight, and every time I glanced toward the darkness beyond the glass, I had the persistent, irrational feeling that something was looking back. Sleep came reluctantly, in fits and starts, on a narrow cot I'd found in the cabin's single bedroom. I dreamed of walking through trees that grew too close together, their branches reaching for me like fingers, and somewhere in the distance, voices calling my name in tones that were almost familiar, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. I woke gasping sometime after midnight. Certain I'd heard those same voices outside the cabin walls, not in my dream, but in the waking world. Threading through the silence like smoke through still air, I lay perfectly still, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I could feel the pulse in my temples. The fire had burned down to embers, painting the room in shades of dying orange, and the cold had crept in while I slept, frosting my breath into pale clouds that hung motionless before my face. For a long moment, there was nothing, just that press of quiet, that sense of being watched by something just beyond the edge of perception. Then I heard it again. Not my name, not exactly, but something that wore the shape of my name the way a corpse wears the shape of the person it used to be. The sound came from somewhere beyond the bedroom window, a whisper that seemed to originate from multiple directions at once, layered and overlapping in a way that made it impossible to determine how many voices were speaking. They were calling to me, beckoning, pleading, promising something I couldn't quite understand, but that filled me with a longing so intense it bordered on physical pain. I found myself standing before I consciously decided to rise, my bare feet on the ice-cold floorboards, my body moving toward the window as if drawn by invisible strings. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to stop, to get back in bed, to cover my ears and wait for dawn. But that voice seemed very far away now, drowned out by the whispering that grew louder and more insistent with every step I took. Through the grimy glass, I saw them, figures standing among the trees at the edge of the clearing, their shapes indistinct in the darkness, but undeniably present, pale smears against the black trunks, swaying slightly as if moved by a wind I couldn't feel. There were dozens of them, maybe more, arranged in a loose semicircle that faced the cabin, faced me. They were still whispering, their voices threading together into something that was almost music, almost language, almost beautiful in a way that the edge of a knife can be beautiful just before it opens your skin. My hand was on the front door latch before I realized I had left the bedroom. The metal was so cold it burned my palm, but I didn't let go and let go, because the voices were inside me now, echoing through the hollow spaces behind my eyes, promising warmth and belonging and an end to the loneliness I hadn't even known I was feeling until that moment. All I had to do was open the door. All I had to do was step outside. All I had to do was join them in the dark between the trees, and I would never be alone again. I don't know what broke the spell. Maybe it was the pain from my burnt palm, finally registering, or maybe somewhere deep in the oldest part of my brain, some survival instinct recognized what was happening and fought back with everything it had. I wrenched my hand away from the latch and stumbled backward, gasping, the voices shrieking in frustration as their hold on me snapped like an overstretched wire. I ran to the bedroom and grabbed my bag, my keys, my boots, didn't bother lacing them, just shoved my feet in and sprinted for the front door. The figures in the trees were moving now, drifting closer to the cabin with that same terrible, swaying motion, their whispers rising to a howl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I burst through the door and into the freezing night, the cold hitting me like a physical blow, and I ran from my car without looking back, fumbling with the keys, dropping them in the snow, snatching them up with numb fingers. The engine turned over on the third try, and I floored the accelerator before the door was even fully closed, my tires spinning on the frozen ground before finally catching. In the rearview mirror, I saw them standing at the edge of the cabin's clearing, motionless now, their pale forms sharp against the darkness, and I could have sworn they were smiling, though they had no faces I could see. I drove until the sun came up, until the mountains flattened into Piedmont, until I could finally get a cell signal and call someone to tell them I was alive. I never went back. I never signed those papers. I let the lawyers handle everything from a distance, and when they told me the property had finally sold to some developer who wanted to build vacation cabins, I felt nothing but relief. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is right and my apartment is too quiet, I hear them again, those voices, calling my name from very far away, patient and hungry, waiting for me to come home. I didn't notice it at first, the second set of footprints in the snow, matching mine step for step, appearing from nowhere and leading into the same darkness. I was walking toward the cranberry wilderness. In December is no place for casual hikers, but I'd been running these trails since I was 14 years old, and I thought I knew every ridge and hollow like the lines on my own palms. My father had brought me here before he passed, teaching me how to read the land, how to navigate by the moss on trees when fog swallowed the sun, how to recognize the subtle signs that meant a storm was coming or that you'd wandered too close to a place where the old things still lived. That last part I'd always dismissed as mountain superstition, the kind of stories old men tell around campfires to scare children into staying close to the fire. I'm not sure what I believe anymore. The snow had been falling since morning when I set out from the trailhead. Fat flicks had accumulated quickly on the frozen ground and transformed the familiar landscape into something strange and muffled. I was aiming for a small shelter my father had built years ago, a 3-sided structure of stacked stone and salvaged lumber that sat in a protected hollow about 8 miles from the nearest road. I'd planned to spend 2 nights out there, reconnecting with the wilderness that had defined so much of my childhood, escaping for a while from the noise and demands of my life in Charleston. The first few hours passed without incident, my boots crunching through the accumulating snow, my breath steaming in the frigid air, my mind gradually emptying of everything except the rhythm of the walk and the beauty of the winter forest. The trees were heavy with white, their branches bowed under the weight, and the only sounds were the whisper of falling snow and the occasional crack of a limb giving way somewhere in the distance. I felt at peace in a way I hadn't for months, maybe years, that rare sense of being exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you were made to do. It was late afternoon when I first noticed something was wrong. The snow had intensified, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet in any direction, and I'd stopped to check my compass and verify I was still on the right bearing. That's when I saw them, another set of prints in the snow behind me, running parallel to my own trail, close enough that I should have seen whoever was making them, but far enough apart that they couldn't have been left by anyone walking beside me. The prints were barefoot, each impression showing the clear outline of toes, and they were fresh enough that the falling snow hadn't yet begun to fill them in. I stood there for a long moment, my heart beginning to beat faster, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. No one walks barefoot in December in the cranberry wilderness. The cold alone would cause frostbite within minutes, hypothermia shortly after. And yet there they were, a perfect line of footprints stretching back the way I'd come, appearing from nowhere and following the exact path I'd taken through the trees. I called out into the snow, my voice sounding flat and small in that vast, white emptiness, asking if anyone was there, if anyone needed help. The only answer was silence, not even the creak of branches or the rustle of wind, just a profound and absolute quiet that seemed to swallow my words before they could travel more than a few feet from my mouth. I waited, listening, my hand instinctively moving to the knife on my belt, but nothing moved in the swirling snow, and no one appeared from between the trees. I told myself it was a trick of the light, some kind of optical illusion created by the snow and my own exhaustion, and I turned back toward my original heading and kept walking, But I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, and every time I did, those prints were still there, parallel to mine, matching my pace exactly, appearing from nowhere and following me into the deepening wilderness. After a while, I realized they weren't just following my path. They were adjusting to it, maintaining that precise distance even when I deliberately veered off course, as if whatever was making them could see me even though I couldn't see it. The shelter was still 2 miles away when the sun began to set, the light draining from the sky with alarming speed, the temperature plummeting as darkness crept in from the east. I pushed my pace, my breath coming harder now, my legs burning from the effort of breaking trail through snow that was now knee-deep in places. The prints beside me kept pace effortlessly, each barefoot impression appearing as cleanly as if it had been stamped into the snow by a machine rather than a living foot. I was maybe half a mile from the shelter when I first heard the breathing. It came from my left. From the empty air above those impossible prints, a sound like lungs filling and emptying, slow and regular and far too close. I stopped walking, my heart hammering against my ribs, and the breathing stopped too. When I started moving again, it resumed, perfectly synchronized with my own ragged gasps, as if the thing beside me was learning my rhythm, preparing to match me breath for breath as it already matched me step for step. The shelter appeared through the trees like a prayer answered. Its dark shape hunched against the hillside, and I ran the last 100 yards with everything I had, not caring anymore about the noise I was making or the energy I was wasting. I threw myself through the entrance and pressed my back against the rear wall, fumbling for my flashlight, my knife already in my other hand, though I couldn't remember drawing it. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the snow-covered ground beyond the shelter's opening, and there they were, those barefoot prints, leading right up to the edge of the structure and stopping. Just stopping, as if whatever had been following me was standing right there, inches from the threshold, invisible and patient and waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my fire burning hot and bright, feeding it every scrap of wood I could reach without leaving the shelter's protection, watching that open entrance with eyes that burned from exhaustion and terror. Several times I heard the breathing again, slow and deliberate, circling the structure just outside the firelight's reach. Once, near dawn, I heard something that might have been a voice not speaking exactly, but making sounds that wanted to be words, that were practicing the shape of human speech without understanding its meaning. When daylight finally came, the snow had stopped and the sky was a hard, brilliant blue that made my light-starved eyes water. The prints around the shelter were gone, covered by fresh snow or simply vanished, and I wasted no time packing my things and heading back toward civilization. I hiked faster than I've ever hiked in my life, checking behind me every few minutes. But the trail remained empty, just my own boots punching through the snow, alone. I reached my truck by early afternoon and drove straight home without stopping. I haven't been back to the cranberry wilderness since, and I don't intend to go. But sometimes, in winter, when fresh snow falls outside my window, I find myself looking for prints in my backyard, barefoot impressions, leading from the tree line to my house, matching my path from driveway to door. So far, I haven't seen any. I don't know what I'll do if I ever do. The congregation turned to look at me as I stepped through the door, their faces smiling and welcoming, and it wasn't until I looked down at the hymnal in my hands that I realized every song inside had been written in a language that shouldn't exist. I had been driving through eastern Kentucky for 3 days when my truck finally gave up on the side of a road I couldn't find on any map I owned. The engine coughed twice and died without ceremony, and when I turned to the key, nothing happened, no click, no grind, not even the courtesy of a dashboard light telling me what had gone wrong. I sat there for a while in the gathering dusk, surrounded by mountains that seemed to lean in closer the longer I looked at them, trying to decide what to do. My phone had stopped working somewhere around noon, which hadn't worried me at the time. Cell service was spotty at best in these parts, and I'd expected to hit a town eventually where I could make a call if needed. But now, stranded in the growing dark with no idea how far the nearest town might be, that dead phone felt like a betrayal. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left, a jacket that wasn't warm enough for a Kentucky February night, and a half-empty bottle of water. The smart thing to do was stay with the vehicle, wait for someone to drive past, flag them down for help. I waited until full dark before I admitted that no one was coming. The road stretched empty in both directions, swallowed by shadows so complete that I couldn't tell where the pavement ended and the forest began. I'd seen maybe 3 cars in the last 4 hours of driving, and none of them had seemed particularly inclined to stop. I was going to have to walk. I grabbed my flashlight and started heading in the direction I'd been driving, figuring that whatever town I'd been aiming for had to be somewhere ahead. The night was cold and clear, the stars overhead burning with that fierce brightness you only see when you're miles from any electric light, and my breath plumed white in the beam of my flashlight as I walked. The forest pressed close on both sides, dark shapes that rustled occasionally in ways I tried very hard not to think about. And I found myself walking faster than necessary, driven by a growing unease I couldn't quite name. I'd been walking maybe 20 minutes when I saw the light. It flickered between the trees off to my left, warm and yellow, too steady to be a fire but too isolated to be a house. I stopped, watching it for a moment, trying to gauge how far away it was and whether the detour would be worth it. The road still stretched empty ahead of me, and that light was the first sign of human habitation I'd seen since my truck died. I left the pavement and started pushing through the undergrowth toward it. The church revealed itself gradually first, the steeple appearing above the tree line, then the white clapboard walls glowing in the light that spilled from its windows, then the small clearing it sat in, neatly kept and surrounded by ancient oaks whose branches seemed to arch protectively over the structure. A sign by the path leading to the front door read Harmony Springs Church of the Everlasting, though I'd never heard of any denomination by that name, and the lettering style looked like it belonged to another century. I could hear singing from inside, voices raised in a hymn I didn't recognize, the melody haunting and beautiful and somehow wrong in a way I couldn't identify. It took me a moment to realize what was bothering me. The harmonies didn't quite match up. Each voice seemed to be singing a slightly different version of the same song, the notes weaving in and out of alignment in a pattern that made my temples throb if I listened too closely. But there were people inside, and people meant warmth, and maybe a phone, and definitely someone who could point me toward the nearest town. I climbed the steps to the front door and pushed it open. The congregation turned to look at me, their faces breaking into smiles that seemed genuinely warm and welcoming. There were maybe 30 of them, dressed in their Sunday best despite it being a Wednesday night, their hymn books held open in their hands. The song faltered but didn't stop, a few voices continuing the melody while others fell silent to watch me enter. "Come in, friend," said the man at the pulpit, a tall, thin figure in a black suit that hung off his frame like it had been made for someone larger. His face was kind, his smile wide and genuine, but something in his eyes made me think of deep water still on the surface, impossible to see what moved beneath. "We've been expecting you." I started to explain about my truck, about needing help, but someone pressed a hymnal into my hands before I could finish. It was old, the leather cover cracked and worn smooth by countless fingers, and when I opened it to follow along with the congregation. I felt the words drain out of me like water from a cracked cup. The pages were covered in writing, but it wasn't any language I'd ever seen. The letters curved and spiraled in patterns that seemed to move when I looked at them directly, rearranging themselves into configurations that hurt my eyes and made my stomach clench with sudden nausea. But the congregants around me were singing from the same books, their mouths forming words I couldn't understand, their voices rising in that terrible discordant harmony. I looked up, wanting to leave, needing to leave, and found that the smiles around me hadn't changed, but their quality had shifted somehow. The warmth was still there, but it felt directed rather than diffuse, focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The man at the pulpit had descended from his platform and was walking toward me, his movements fluid and strange, as if his joints bent in directions they shouldn't. "You've come such a long way," he said, his voice gentle and terrible. "We've been preparing for you. The road brought you here. The old road, the one that remembers. It always brings them to us eventually." He reached out to touch my face, and I saw that his fingers were too long, the knuckles too numerous, the nails dark and curved like something dug from deep in the earth. I dropped the hymnal and ran. I don't remember leaving the church or crossing the clearing or fighting through the undergrowth back to the road. I just remember running, my lungs burning, my legs screaming, the sound of that discordant hymn following me through the dark trees, growing neither louder nor softer no matter how far I ran. I ran until I hit pavement, then kept running until I saw headlights coming toward me and threw myself into the road waving my arms. The pickup that stopped for me was driven by a farmer, heading home from a late livestock call, and he looked at me like I'd lost my mind when I tried to explain what had happened. He drove me to the nearest town, a small collection of houses and businesses about 3 miles down the road, and I spent the night in a motel room with every light on and the television blaring. In the morning, I asked about the church. The woman at the front desk gave me a strange look and said there was no church in that stretch of woods, hadn't been for decades. Not since the Harmony Springs congregation had disappeared one winter night in 1952. All 32 members vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only an empty building that eventually rotted back into the forest floor. They towed my truck the next day, and the mechanic found nothing wrong with it. Engine turned over on the first try, ran like it had just come off the lot. I didn't go back to look for the church. I drove straight to the interstate and didn't stop until I was 3 states away. But I still hear that hymn sometimes, in the spaces between sleeping and waking, and I know that somewhere out there, the congregation is still singing, still waiting for the next traveler the old road decides to bring them. My grandfather told me there are staircases in these mountains that go nowhere, standing alone among the trees like monuments to something terrible, and the only rule that matters is never, under any circumstances, climb them. The first time I saw the stairs, I was 12 years old, hiking with my grandfather through the woods behind his house in the mountains of western North Carolina. We'd been out since dawn, checking his trap lines, and I was tired and hungry and paying more attention to the ache in my feet than to where I was walking. That's why I nearly walked right into them before I realized what I was seeing. They rose from the forest floor without foundation or purpose, a set of concrete steps, maybe 15 of them, climbing toward the canopy and stopping in mid. No building attached, no platform at the top, just stairs standing in the middle of the woods like they'd been dropped there from somewhere else. The concrete was old but unmarked, free of moss or weathering despite clearly having been there for decades, and the edges were still sharp enough that I could have cut myself on them. I remember starting toward them, fascinated by the impossibility. of what I was seeing, wanting to touch them to make sure they were real. My grandfather's hand closed on my shoulder so hard it bruised, and when I turned to look at him, his face was the color of old bone. His eyes fixed on the stairs with an expression I'd never seen before and never wanted to see again. "Don't," he said, and his voice was shaking. "Never touch them. Never climb them. You look away, and you walk away, and you don't ever go back." He pulled me close to his side and guided me around the stairs in a wide arc, never taking his eyes off them, never loosening his grip on my shoulder. I asked him what they were, why they were there, what would happen if I climbed them. He didn't answer. He didn't talk for the rest of the day, and when we got home, he poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and sat staring at the wall until dark. I never forgot those stairs, but I followed my grandfather's rule. When I started hiking on my own in my late teens, I saw them again, different stairs in different places. Some concrete, some wood, some stone, all standing alone in the forest without explanation or context. Each time, I looked away and walked away, just like he'd taught me. Each time, I felt something watching from the top of those impossible steps, something that wanted me to climb, that promised answers to questions I hadn't thought to ask. My grandfather died when I was 26, and I inherited his land, his house, and his trap lines. I also inherited his journals, decades of handwritten notes detailing every strange thing he'd encountered in those mountains, things he'd never spoken about to anyone while he was alive. Most of it I could dismiss as the paranoid ramblings of an old man who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. But the entries about the stairs made my blood run cold. He'd cataloged dozens of them over the years, mapping their locations, noting their appearances, tracking the patterns of their presence. Some stayed in one place for decades. Others moved, appearing in new locations without warning, sometimes overnight. But the most disturbing entries were about what happened to people who climbed them. There were newspaper clippings, missing persons reports, obituaries of hikers, and hunters who'd vanished without a trace. In each case, my grandfather had noted the same thing. The last place they'd been seen was near a set of stairs in the woods. I should have burned those journals. I should have sold the land and moved back to Charlotte and forgotten everything my grandfather had tried to teach me. Instead, I found myself hiking deeper into the mountains than I'd ever gone before, searching for answers to questions I probably didn't want answered. I found the stairs on the 3rd day, not concrete this time, but stone, ancient-looking blocks, fitted together with a precision that seemed impossible for their apparent age. They rose from a clearing ringed by deadfall, 20 steps climbing into the gray February sky, and at the top stood a door. It's not a door frame, not an archway, just a door, wooden, weathered, ordinary-looking, hanging in the empty air like the punchline to a joke I didn't understand. I stood at the base of those stairs for a long time, my grandfather's voice in my head telling me to look away and walk away, never go back. But the door was something new, something none of his journals had mentioned, and I couldn't stop thinking about what might be on the other side. What if there were answers there? What if my grandfather had spent his whole life afraid of something that could be understood, could be explained, could be made less terrible by the simple act of knowing? I put my foot on the first step before I consciously decided to climb. The stone was cold even through my boot, and the moment I made contact, everything around me went silent, not quiet, but absent, as if sound itself had been removed from the world. I could see the trees moving in the wind, could see leaves falling, but I heard nothing. Nothing except my own heartbeat, suddenly deafening, and beneath it, another sound, rising from somewhere below me. From beneath the stairs, from underneath the mountain itself, it was breathing, Something enormous was breathing. Slow and deep and patient, and with each exhale, I felt the stone steps vibrate beneath my feet. I looked up at the door, and it was open now, when had it opened, and through it I could see not sky but a space that seemed to stretch forever inward, a darkness that wasn't empty but full, packed with shapes that moved in patterns my mind refused to interpret. I don't remember climbing down. I don't remember the hike back to my grandfather's house. I remember waking up in my truck the next morning, parked in his driveway, my hiking boots still on my feet and crusted with mud that smelled like nothing I'd ever encountered before. Earthy, but wrong, organic but old, like something that had been buried for centuries and was only now beginning to surface. I've been back to those mountains since, but I've never looked for the stairs. I don't need to look anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that breathing again, slow and patient, coming from somewhere beneath me, beneath the floor, beneath the earth itself. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that door standing, open against the darkness, waiting for me to climb the rest of the way up, to step through and see what's on the other side. My grandfather was wrong about one thing. You can look away, you can walk away, but once you've set foot on those stairs, you never really leave. Part of you stays there, climbing forever toward a door that never stops opening. And sometimes, in dreams, in moments of weakness, in the space between heartbeats, you can feel yourself getting closer to the top,